Judge announces internship opening, but the one who knocks on the door leaves everyone in silence. No one expected that day to end the way it did. No one in the room, none of the candidates who had arrived early, not even the secretary who knew the county courthouse like the back of her hand. No one. And the most remarkable part is that it all started in an absolutely normal way, with a simple announcement on a Tuesday morning that seemed like so many others. Dr. Harrison Vance had the reputation of being a man who didn't let anything into his courthouse that he hadn't approved beforehand. 32 years sitting in that aged mahogany chair. 32 years looking at those walls lined with dark wood, and those golden lamps that no one ever replaced because they seemed eternal. For him, the order of things wasn't a detail, it was life itself. Each candidate selected, each paper signed, each decision made with the weight of someone who knows the last word is always his. But that morning, when the door at the back of the room opened and everyone turned their heads at the same time, Dr. Harrison stood still, his hands resting open on the wooden desk, his eyes fixed on the entrance. And the silence that fell wasn't the silence of respect he was used to. It was another kind of silence, the kind that tightens the chest of everyone in the room. The young woman stopped at the threshold, dark, long hair, black suit, light blouse. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, nothing that justified the reaction of those in the room. But the name she said when she opened her mouth was enough to change the air of that place. Maya Sterling, I'm here to apply for the internship opening. And it was exactly at that moment that Dr. Harrison realized that Tuesday wasn't going to end the same way it had begun. The announcement of the opening had been made 3 weeks earlier, discreetly, as was customary at the courthouse. Mrs. Evelyn, the secretary who had been there longer than any intern who had ever passed through that hallway, had posted a notice on the lobby bulletin board and sent out a notice to the local law schools. One position, technical profile, good academic performance, full-time availability. Nothing extraordinary. 12 applications had come in. Dr. Harrison had personally screened them, as he always did, and selected 5 candidates for the opening collective interview, that meeting in which he presented the courthouse, talked about what he expected from an intern, and then let each one introduce themselves. A kind of first impression he took very seriously. The other 4 candidates were already seated in the lined-up chairs when Maya came through that back door, the one that opened onto the side hallway, the one almost no one used. She was late. Not very, about 8 minutes, but enough for the meeting to have already started, and for all eyes to turn to her the moment the door creaked. Mrs. Evelyn, who was sitting in the corner with a notebook on her lap, looked at the young woman, and then looked at Dr. Harrison. Only someone who knew the secretary well would have noticed that movement. A fraction of a second, almost nothing. But she noticed the name on the makeshift badge Maya was holding in her hand, and something on Mrs. Evelyn's face changed. Dr. Harrison kept looking at the young woman for a time that seemed too long for the context. "Come in," he said. His voice came out the same as always, firm, but anyone paying attention noticed that he took longer than usual to say those 2 words. Maya walked to the empty chair at the end of the row, straightened her blazer, and waited. She didn't seem nervous, and that alone was already something that drew attention, because all the other candidates, 4 young people who had probably barely slept from anxiety, were tense in a way you could feel in the air. Dr. Harrison resumed the presentation. He talked about the history of the county courthouse, about the principles that guided his work, about what he expected of every person who walked through that door. It was a speech he had given so many times that it came out almost automatically. But anyone watching closely would have seen his eyes drifting now and then to the corner where Maya was sitting. When it came time for each candidate to introduce themselves, Dr. Harrison asked them to start from the left. Maya was at the far right. She would be last. The first 4 spoke in a predictable way. College, semester, prior experience, why they wanted to intern there. Dr. Harrison listened, took notes, asked a question here and there. The dynamic was familiar. When it was Maya's turn, she stood up slowly, with that calm that had drawn attention from the start. "My name is Maya Sterling. I'm in my 9th semester of law school. I have the highest GPA in my class. and I've worked as an assistant at 2 law firms over the past 3 years." She paused briefly. "But the main reason I'm here is personal, and I think Dr. Harrison knows that." The silence returned. Unlike before, this one carried a weight that the other candidates didn't understand but could feel. Dr. Harrison set his pen down on the bench carefully. "Personal reasons stay outside this room," he said. "Here, what matters is technical merit." "With all due respect," Maya replied, "you were the first to mix the two, 8 years ago." Look, I needed to stop here for a moment before continuing, because when I first read this part, I kept wondering what had happened between these two. What could a young woman like that, at the start of her career, be carrying inside her that made her walk into a room full of people and say that, with such composure? Sometimes the hardest courage isn't the kind that shouts, it's the kind that speaks softly, eye to eye. Dr. Harrison called for a 10-minute recess. The other candidates were led to the waiting room by Mrs. Evelyn, who did so with the skill of someone who had seen enough delicate situations to know when it was time to clear the space. Maya stayed. She hadn't stood up when the others left. She waited, hands in her lap, like someone who had waited long enough to know that a little longer made no difference. Dr. Harrison stared at her for a long time after the door closed. "You should have told me you were going to apply," he said. "You would have rejected my application." "I would have reviewed it." "No," she said, without harshness, but without softening. "You would have found a technical reason to disqualify me before even seeing me." Harrison got up from his chair and walked to the window. There was a slight stoop in his shoulders that wasn't from laziness. It was the kind that time puts on someone who has carried something heavy for a long time. Outside, the courthouse yard was empty at that hour of the morning. "Your father's case," he said, without turning around, "was decided within the law." "I know," Maya replied. "I read the entire case file. 3 times. That answer made Harrison turn around. Arthur Sterling had owned a woodworking shop that had been around for 22 years in a small upstate town when the lawsuit reached Dr. Harrison's courthouse. A conflict with a business partner who had filed a suit alleging irregularities in the division of an old contract. The case was complicated, full of documents, full of possible interpretations, and Dr. Harrison back then had made a decision that favored the partner. The woodworking shop closed 18 months later. Arthur never managed to rebuild himself the same way, and the Sterling family spent a decade trying to rebalance a life that had been shaken all at once. Maya was 12 years old when the case was decided. She didn't quite understand what was happening. She only knew that her father came home more and more silent, and that her mother sometimes stayed in the kitchen with red eyes, thinking no one would notice. It was only when she got into law school and went looking for the documents that she fully understood what had happened. "I didn't come here to get revenge on anyone," she told Dr. Harrison, still seated, still with that calm that disarmed any emotional argument he might use. "I came because I want to understand how a decision like that is made. I want to see up close how a judge thinks. I want to learn. And why here? There are other courthouses. Because this is where it happened." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Harrison walked over to the table, opened the folder with her resume. High GPA. Recommendations from the firms where she had worked. No blemishes, no technical gap that would justify a refusal. She had arrived late, but that wasn't sufficient reason, and they both knew it. He closed the folder. "You'll start on Monday," he said, "like any other intern. No special treatment, no conversations about the past during office hours." Maya stood up. "I didn't ask for special treatment," she replied. "I never did." She left the room with the same calm step with which she had entered, and Harrison remained there, looking at the closed folder on the table, with that feeling you get when you realize that something that had been buried for a long time has just been unearthed, and there's no way to cover it back up. The first days of the internship went by in a way that anyone from the outside would have called normal. Maya arrived early, did the tasks Mrs. Evelyn assigned, stayed late when she needed to. She didn't complain, didn't ask more than necessary, didn't cause problems. She was good at what she did, and everyone at the courthouse quickly noticed. Mrs. Evelyn, who was 63 years old and had an extraordinary ability to observe without seeming to observe, kept an eye on her from the start. Not out of suspicion, but with that interest of someone who recognizes something familiar in a person. One afternoon, when the two of them were alone organizing archived case files, the secretary said, without looking up from the documents, "Does your father still have the woodworking shop?" Maya paused for a second. "He has a small workshop at home. It's not the old woodworking shop anymore, but he never gave up working with wood." Mrs. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I knew your father by name," she said, "back during the case. It was a name that came up a lot here." Maya waited, without rushing. "Mrs. Evelyn," she said after a moment, "do you remember anything about that case? Anything that wasn't in the records?" The secretary gathered the papers slowly, tapped the edges on the table to align them, put the clip on. She did it all without hurrying. "I remember a lot of things," she said. "But memory isn't a document." And it was exactly that phrase that stuck in Maya's head over the following days. She didn't stay idle. In her spare time, in the early morning hours at the apartment where she lived alone, she returned to the documents of the old case, to the ones she had obtained over the years, and began to organize everything in a different way, with the eye of someone who now understood the law, with the eye of someone who had studied and worked to understand. And it was then, on a Thursday night, with papers spread across the kitchen table and coffee cooling beside her, that she saw it. An inconsistency. Small, but it was there. A date in one of the documents presented by the other party that didn't match another document from the same period. It wasn't a glaring error. It was subtle, the kind that would go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking carefully. But for those who were there, it was impossible not to see. There are things you discover that leave you standing still for a while, trying to understand the size of what's in front of you. I imagine that's how it was for her that night. Maya arrived at the county courthouse the next morning with the documents inside a folder. She waited until the noon break, when the other interns went out to lunch, and the hallway went quiet, and knocked on the door of Dr. Harrison's office. "I have something I'd like to show you, sir," she said. Harrison looked at the folder, then at her. "Have a seat." Maya spread the documents across his desk and explained what she had found, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the precision of someone who had studied long and hard to get to that point. The date on the transfer document that didn't line up with the record of another transaction from the same month. The detail that, if verified, would suggest the document presented in the case might not have been authentic. Harrison read in silence for a long time. Maya waited. "You realize what you're implying," he said, without looking up. "I'm implying that you might have been deceived, sir," she replied. "Just like my father was." That stopped Harrison. For 8 years he had carried the decision of that case like a stone that was exactly where it belonged. It had been technically correct. He had followed what the documents presented. But there was a part of him, a small part he had never allowed to grow, that had been uneasy about that case from the very beginning, a feeling he had learned to ignore. "This would require a formal verification," he said. "I can't just reopen a case based on a suspicion." "I know," Maya said. "That's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" She paused for a moment. "I want you to acknowledge that you might have been deceived, not in public, not in a document, just here between us. Because my father spent 8 years thinking he had done something wrong, that he had failed somehow. And he didn't fail. The case failed." Harrison set his glasses down on the documents and ran a hand over his face. His hair was completely white now, his face bearing the marks of a man who had lived a great deal, and in that moment he seemed to carry every one of those years in a way that was rarely visible. "Maya," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formality of any other context. "I need you to understand something." She waited. "When a case comes to me, I analyze what's there. Only what's there. Not what's missing, not what could have been presented differently. What's there?" He looked at the documents. "If what you found is confirmed, it means I was deceived by fraudulent documentation, and that's a serious matter, something I would need to investigate the right way, with the right tools." "So you'll investigate?" He took a moment to answer. "I'll verify," he he said, carefully, and the proper way. Maya closed the folder slowly. That's enough, she said. She stood up, but before she reached the door, Harrison spoke again. Why didn't you go to a lawyer with this? You could have tried to reopen the case through other channels. She stood with her hand on the doorknob. Because my father is too old now for another battle. He doesn't need another lawsuit. He needs to know it wasn't him who failed. She turned her face to the side, not exactly toward him, toward some point in the middle of the room. Sometimes what we need most isn't victory. It's understanding. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the following weeks, Dr. Harrison did what he had said he would do. With discretion, without making a fuss, he reached out to the channels he knew to verify the authenticity of the documents that had been presented in the case 8 years earlier. It was a slow, bureaucratic path, full of walls to get around. But he knew the paths. Maya continued her internship. She kept arriving early, doing her part well without asking about the progress of the verification. One afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn stopped beside her as she was organizing a box of old files. You look a lot like your father, the secretary said out of nowhere. Maya looked up. No one's ever told me that. It's not about appearance, it's about stubbornness. Mrs. Evelyn gave a crooked smile. The good stubbornness of someone who doesn't give up on getting where they need to go. Maya was quiet for a moment. You knew, she said slowly, you knew there was something strange about that case when it happened. Mrs. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She straightened the papers on the shelf carefully. What I knew was that there was a document that had arrived past the deadline and had been accepted anyway due to pressure from the opposing side. I told Dr. Harrison at the time. She paused. He considered it within the limits of the regulations, and he never spoke about it again. Never again. The secretary took another box from the shelf. But I wrote it down, because it's my habit. I write everything down. That was the sentence that opened the second door. Mrs. Evelyn's notebook, that silent habit of decades, held records of dates, of conversations, of details that weren't in any official document. And when, on a rainy afternoon, with the county courthouse nearly empty, she placed the notebook from that period on the table and let Maya read the right page, there it was. The document's entry date, the note that it had arrived past the deadline, the name of the person who had called to pressure for its acceptance. It was Arthur's partner, the same one who had filed the case, the same one who had won. When Harrison saw that note, combined with what the technical verification had begun to indicate, he was silent for a very long time. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be interrupted. Then he picked up the phone. It wasn't a matter of reopening the case, at least not immediately, not in the simple way. But there was a possible path, a request for document review based on formal irregularity, which could, in the long run, lead to reparation. It was complex, it was time-consuming, and Arthur Sterling would probably never recover what he had lost in material value. But the record, the truth put on paper, was possible. Harrison explained this to Maya the following week, with documents on the table, with technical language, but also with a clarity she hadn't expected. It will be slow, he said, and it may not change much in practice. I know, but it will change the record. That's what matters. Harrison looked at her. You'll need a lawyer to handle the request. It can't be you yourself, for obvious conflict of interest reasons. I have someone who can help me, he nodded. Then after a moment he said something she didn't expect. I should have pushed harder on that case. There was a discomfort I recognized and decided not to pursue. He didn't apologize with those words. It was almost heavier than an apology. It was a 70-year-old man acknowledging out loud that he had failed at one of the things he considered most important in his own life. That won't leave my mind any time soon. Maya looked at him. There was something in that moment that was different from everything she had imagined over all those years. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something quieter than that. You were deceived, she said. That's also real. And it was the most generous thing she could have said. The review request was filed 2 months later, handled by a lawyer Maya knew from law school, an experienced woman who took the case when she understood what was at stake. It was a long road ahead, full of steps and waiting, but it was underway. On the afternoon the filing was confirmed, Maya called her father. Arthur Sterling was 67 years old, with a voice that still carried the calm rhythm of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, and when his daughter explained what was happening, he stayed quiet for a while. "Maya," he said finally. "Dad, how long did you spend on this?" "About 8 years," she answered, with a lightness that wasn't indifference. It was the lightness of someone who had made it through the other side of something very heavy, but I only really worked on it in the last few months. Arthur fell silent again. She could hear his breathing on the other end, that silence she'd known since she was a child, his silence when he was processing something too big to turn into words quickly. "You didn't have to do this for me," he said at last. "I know," she replied, "but I needed to do it for myself." The internship ended on schedule, 6 months after that Tuesday when Maya had walked through the back door and left everyone in silence. She left with a letter of recommendation from Dr. Harrison, written by hand, saying she had a rare ability to separate emotion from analysis without losing the humanity of either. She read that letter 3 times before putting it away. Mrs. Evelyn, on her last day, gave her a quiet hug in the hallway and said, "Take good care of your father." Nothing more. And Maya left through that same back door, the one almost no one used, carrying with her everything she'd brought in and a little more than she'd expected to find. Dr. Harrison stood at his office window for a long time that afternoon, looking out at the yard. There was something different in the way he stood. It wasn't pure regret. It was something more complex, the feeling of someone who looks back and sees a path that could have been different, without the illusion that the past can be changed, but with the clarity that the present, that very moment, had been different. And sometimes that's the most honest thing life offers. End of the story. That story stayed with me for a good while after I finished reading it. Maya didn't go after revenge. She went after something even harder. The truth, and a recognition no one could guarantee she'd find. It makes you think about how many similar stories are out there, of people who carried a weight for years without understanding where it came from. Let us know what you thought in the comments. We read everything carefully. And where are you watching from right now? I'd love to know. If this story reached you, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Thanks so much for the company today, for the